Jake Morassen wiped the sweat from his forehead as he watched another group of police officers struggle through the obstacle course he had built behind the old Miller farm. These cops from the county over were supposed to be tough, but they were huffing and puffing like beginners. Jake shook his head and called out to his teammate Rico, who was timing the run. "How long this time?" Jake asked, already knowing the answer would disappoint him. 12 minutes and 30 seconds, Rico replied, clicking his stopwatch. That's, actually their best time today, Jake let out a long sigh. Back in Afghanistan, his squad could complete this same course in under 8 minutes, even with full combat gear. These local law enforcement guys were trying their best, but they just didn't have what it took. They hadn't been through what Jake and his team had experienced overseas. The small town of Millbrook had always been quiet. With only about 3,000 people, everyone knew everyone else's business. When Jake and his 3 buddies came back from their deployment 2 years ago, the whole town treated them like heroes. There were parades, free meals at the diner, and handshakes wherever they went. People would stop them on the street just to say thank you for their service. That hero worship had given Jake an idea. Why not use their military training to help the community? He started Morrison Security Solutions with Rico Valdez, Tommy Walsh, and Shun. All 4 of them had served together in the same unit overseas. And they knew each other's moves like clockwork. The business started small. They offered security for local events, trained the volunteer fire department in emergency response, and even helped the high school football team with physical conditioning. But word spread quickly about their skills, and soon police departments from neighboring towns were asking for tactical training. Jake loved every minute of it. Finally, his military experience was paying off in civilian life. Unlike some of his veteran friends who struggled to find their place after coming home, Jake felt like he had found his calling. He was the go-to guy when people needed real expertise. Not some weekend warrior nonsense. Rico had been his sergeant overseas, and the man never missed a detail. He could spot a rookie mistake from 50 yards away, and had this way of explaining things that made even the most confused trainee understand. Rico took pride in pushing people to their limits, just like their drill instructors had done to them years ago. Tommy was the youngest of the group, but don't let that fool you. The kid had nerves of steel and could handle any weapon they put in his hands. He was also the charmer of the group, always making jokes and keeping spirits high during the tough training sessions. The local cops loved him because he could break the tension when things got too serious. Chun was their tactical expert. She had this amazing ability to read situations and come up with solutions on the spot. During their deployment, she had saved their lives more than once by thinking 3 steps ahead of the enemy. Now, she used those same skills to design training scenarios that really challenged their students. Together, they made an incredible team. In 2 years of running their security business, they had never lost a training exercise, not once. Police departments would bring their best officers for weekend training camps, thinking they could show up these small-town veterans. Every single time, Jake's team would outperform them in every category. The success had made them confident, maybe too confident. They started referring to people without military experience as civilians who wouldn't understand real pressure. Jake would often tell clients that there was a difference between reading about tactics in a book and actually using them when bullets were flying over your head. The local sheriff, Mike Patterson, had become one of their biggest supporters. Patterson was a good man who had served the community for over 20 years, but he knew his limitations. He would regularly ask Jake's team for advice on security matters, especially when there were concerns about drug activity or potential threats to local events. "You boys have seen the real thing," Patterson would always say. "The rest of us are just playing catch-up." This respect from the community felt good, but it also fed into their growing sense of superiority. Jake and his team began to believe that their combat experience made them untouchable in any situation. They had faced life and death overseas, so what could possibly challenge them in a sleepy town like Millbrook? The answer to that question came on a Tuesday morning in late spring. Jake was at the farm, setting up new equipment for an upcoming training session when Rico called him with interesting news. "You're not going to believe this," Rico said, excitement clear in his voice. Some big development company wants to buy up half the farmland around here. They want to build some massive industrial complex. Jake stopped what he was doing. What kind of complex? Chemical processing or something like that? The kind of thing that brings in hundreds of trucks every day and changes everything about this place. The news hit Jake like a punch to the gut. Millbrook was perfect the way it was. It was quiet, safe, and had given him and his team a chance to build something meaningful. The idea of some outside company coming in and changing everything made his blood boil. Within hours, the phone was ringing nonstop. Concerned citizens were calling Jake's security company asking for help. They had heard about the development plans and were worried about what it would mean for their community. Property values, traffic, pollution, noise, everything they loved about their small town was at risk. Mrs. Henderson, who owned the flower shop on Main Street, called Jake personally. "We need someone who knows how to handle these corporate types," she said. "They're going to try to steamroll right over us, and we need protection." Jake felt a familiar surge of purpose. This was exactly the kind of situation where his team's skills would make a difference. They had protected American interests overseas, and now they could protect their own community from invasion by outsiders. The town council called an emergency meeting for that Friday night. The development company had promised to send representatives to answer questions and address concerns. Jake's team was officially hired to provide security, consultation, and crowd control for the meeting. As Jake hung up the phone after talking to the town council president, he felt that old familiar confidence building up inside him. His team had handled hostile situations in war zones. They had dealt with crowds, managed security, and kept the peace under much more dangerous circumstances than a small-town meeting. "This should be easy," he told Rico later that day. "A bunch of city folks in suits trying to intimidate small-town people. They have no idea what they're walking into." Rico nodded in agreement. "We'll make sure they understand that this community is protected." Jake looked out at the peaceful farmland surrounding his training facility. In just a few days, he would get his first look at these corporate invaders who thought they could just waltz into Millbrook and take over. He had no idea that his military confidence was about to meet its match in a way he never could have imagined. The stage was set for a confrontation that would teach Jake Morrison and his team a hard lesson about the difference between the wars they thought they knew and the battles they were actually about to fight. Friday evening arrived faster than Jake expected. The community center was packed with more people than he had ever seen at a town meeting. Farmers, shop owners, retirees, and young families filled every seat, with more standing along the walls. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jake and his team arrived 30 minutes early to scout the location and set up their security positions. They wore their matching black polo shirts with the Morrison security logo, and each man carried himself with the confident posture that came from years of military training. Jake positioned himself near the main entrance, Rico took the side door, Tommy covered the back exit, and Shane stationed herself where she could observe the entire room. "Remember," Jake told his team through their earpieces, "we're here to protect our community. These corporate types think they can just walk in here and take over, but they're about to learn that Millbrook doesn't back down." At exactly 7 o'clock, a black SUV pulled up outside the community center. Jake watched through the window as 5 people stepped out. His first thought was disappointment. These were the big, bad corporate security team that everyone was worried about. They looked like insurance salesmen. The leader appeared to be a man in his 40s, average height, wearing a simple gray suit that probably came from a department store. He had the kind of face you would forget 5 minutes after meeting him. Nothing intimidating about him at all. The other 4 were equally unremarkable. 2 men and 2 women who looked like they had just finished a day at the office. Jake spoke into his earpiece. "Target acquired. 5 individuals, no visible weapons, no tactical gear. This is going to be easier than we thought." Rico's voice crackled back. "They look like they're headed to a business meeting, not a fight." As the group entered the community center, Jake stepped forward to intercept them. He made sure to stand at his full height and cross his arms in a way that showed off his military bearing. This was psychological warfare 101, established dominance from the first moment. "Evening," Jake said in his most authoritative voice. "I'm Jake Morrison, head of security for tonight's meeting. You folks are the development company representatives?" The man in the gray suit looked up at Jake with calm, almost amused eyes. "That's right, I'm David Price, and this is my team. We're here for the community meeting." Jake studied Price's face, looking for signs of nervousness or intimidation. Instead, he found something that bothered him: complete calm. Most people were at least a little impressed when they met Jake and learned about his military background. Price acted like he was meeting any random person on the street. "Well, Mr. Price," Jake continued, "I want to make sure you understand that this is a peaceful community and we intend to keep it that way. The people here have concerns about your project, and they deserve respectful answers." Price nodded politely. "Of course. We're here to have a productive conversation with the community." Something about the man's tone irritated Jake. Price wasn't showing the proper respect for the situation. He wasn't acknowledging Jake's authority or the seriousness of the opposition he was facing. It was like he didn't understand that Jake and his team were combat veterans who had seen real action. The meeting began with Mayor Roberts introducing the development company's proposal. Price stood up and gave a polished presentation about jobs, economic growth, and community benefits. He used charts and graphs to show how similar projects had helped other small towns. The man was smooth, Jake had to give him that, but when the questions started, things got heated quickly. Mrs. Henderson stood up and demanded to know about environmental impact. Farmer Johnson wanted to know about water usage. Young mother Lisa Chun asked about air quality and safety for children. Price's team answered every question with more charts and studies. They had responses prepared for everything, which only made the crowd more suspicious. These people weren't used to slick corporate presentations. They wanted straight answers, not fancy PowerPoint slides. Jake could feel the mood in the room turning darker. His neighbors were getting frustrated, and Price's team seemed completely unbothered by the hostility. In fact, they almost seemed to be enjoying it. During a particularly heated exchange about property taxes, Jake decided it was time to make his presence known. He walked to the front of the room and positioned himself between Price's team and the crowd. "Folks," Jake announced, his voice carrying the authority he had learned in the military, "I think what people are trying to say is that outsiders coming into our community need to understand that we look out for each other here. We've been through tough times together, and we don't appreciate people who think they can just march in here and change everything." He turned to face Price directly. "You and your people might be used to pushing around other communities, but Millbrook is different. We've got people here who know how to stand up for what's right." The room went quiet. Jake felt satisfied that he had finally gotten through to these corporate types. This was the moment when they would realize they were dealing with serious people, not some pushover small town. Instead, Price just smiled. It wasn't a nervous smile or a fake business smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they find something genuinely amusing. "Mr. Morrison," Price said in that same calm tone, "I appreciate your commitment to your community. It's clear that you care deeply about the people here." Jake waited for the "but" that would show Price was backing down, or at least taking him seriously. Instead, Price continued with that same relaxed confidence. "You boys might want to reconsider your approach, though. This isn't Afghanistan, and we're not insurgents hiding in caves." The words hit Jake like a slap in the face. How did this random corporate security guy know about Afghanistan? Jake had never mentioned his military service during the meeting, and the way Price said it, so casual, so dismissive, made Jake's blood boil. Rico's voice came through his earpiece. "Boss, how does he know about our deployment?" Jake stared at Price, trying to read the man's expression. There was something behind those calm eyes that Jake couldn't quite identify. It reminded him of the look he had seen on the faces of certain officers overseas, the ones who knew more than they were saying. "Is that some kind of threat?" Jake asked, his military training telling him to probe for more information. Price shook his head, still wearing that infuriating smile. Just friendly advice. Sometimes the best security comes from understanding the situation you're actually in, not the one you think you're in. The meeting continued for another hour, but Jake couldn't focus on the questions and answers anymore. His mind kept going back to Price's comment about Afghanistan. There were only a few ways a random corporate security guy could know about their deployment. Either someone had told him, or he had access to information that regular citizens shouldn't have. After the meeting ended, Jake watched Price's team pack up their materials and head for the exit. They moved with a casual efficiency that struck Jake as almost too smooth. These people weren't rattled by the hostile crowd or concerned about the obvious opposition to their project. As Price walked past Jake on his way out, he paused for just a moment. "Nice meeting you, Captain Morrison. Give my regards to Sergeant Valdez, Corporal Chun, and Private Walsh." Price was out the door before Jake could respond. The man had just rattled off the ranks and names of Jake's entire team information. That definitely wasn't public knowledge. Jake's mind raced as he tried to process what had just happened. Who exactly were these people, and how much did they know about him and his team? For the first time since coming home from overseas, Jake Morrison felt like he might be in over his head. Jake couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard Price's voice saying those names and ranks. How did a corporate security guy know military details about his team? Jake had checked their company website after the meeting, and it looked completely normal. Development projects, environmental studies, community outreach. Nothing that would explain how Price knew so much about them. By Saturday morning, Jake had made up his mind. If these people wanted to play games, he would show them what real professionals could do. He called an emergency meeting with his team at the training facility. "Something's not right about these corporate guys," Jake told Rico, Tommy, and Chun, as they gathered around the planning table in his office. "Price knew too much about us, way too much." Chin leaned forward, her tactical mind already working. "What kind of information are we talking about? Our ranks, our names even mentioned?" "Afghanistan specifically," Jake replied. "Either someone's been talking or these people have resources we don't know about." Tommy cracked his knuckles, a habit he'd picked up during their deployment. "So what's the plan? We can't just sit around and wait for them to make the next move." Jake spread out a map of the town on the table. "We're going to do what we do best, gather intelligence. I want to know everything about these people. Where they're staying, what they're doing, who they're talking to. We treat this like a reconnaissance mission," Rico nodded approvingly. "Standard surveillance operation. We've done this 100 times overseas." The plan was simple and professional, or so Jake thought. They would establish observation posts around town, track Price's team's movements, and document their activities. Nothing illegal, nothing aggressive, just good old-fashioned intelligence gathering. Jake assigned sectors to each team member. Rico would cover the main hotel where the corporate team was staying. Tommy would monitor the diner and other public places where they might eat or meet locals. Chun would keep an eye on the town hall and municipal buildings. Jake would coordinate from his truck and provide mobile surveillance. They started the operation Sunday morning, using techniques they had learned in the military. Radio check-ins every 30 minutes, coded language, careful positioning to avoid detection. Jake felt confident that his team's training would give them a major advantage over some corporate security guys who probably learned their skills from weekend courses. The first few hours went smoothly. Rico reported that Price's team had left their hotel around 9 in the morning and split up around town. Tommy spotted 2 of them having breakfast at Murphy's Diner, acting like normal tourists. Chun observed one of the women taking pictures near the proposed development site. "This is almost too easy," Jake radioed to his team. "These people have no idea they're being watched." But as the day progressed, strange things started happening. Tommy reported that the 2 people at the diner seemed to be having an awfully long breakfast. They'd been there for over 2 hours, just drinking coffee and reading newspapers. Chin noticed that the woman taking pictures was being very systematic, almost like she was conducting her own surveillance of the area. The first real sign of trouble came around noon. Jake was parked on Elm Street watching the municipal building. Through binoculars when his radio crackled with Rico's voice. "Boss, we might have a problem. I just saw Price looking directly at my position through what looked like binoculars of his own." Jake's stomach dropped. "Are you sure he made you?" "Pretty sure. He gave me a little wave. This wasn't good." Jake had been in enough surveillance operations to know that if one team member was compromised, the whole operation was at risk. He was about to call for a tactical withdrawal when Tommy's voice came over the radio. Boss? The two people at the diner just got up and walked straight over to the window. They're looking right at me and smiling." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. This was impossible. His team was using military-grade surveillance techniques. They had positioned themselves carefully, used proper cover, and followed all the protocols they had learned overseas. How could a bunch of corporate security guards have detected them so easily? "Everyone pull back to Rally Point Alpha," Jake ordered, using their code name for the training facility. "We're compromised." As his team regrouped at the farm, Jake tried to make sense of what had happened. June was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "Boss, I don't think these people are regular corporate security. The way they spotted us, the coordination between their team members, that was professional-level counter-surveillance." Tommy nodded in agreement. "The two at the diner weren't just having breakfast. They were running their own operation, and we walked right into it." Jake refused to accept that his team had been outplayed so easily. They were combat veterans with real experience. These corporate types might have some training, but they couldn't match years of actual fieldwork. "We're going to try a different approach," Jake announced. "Tonight, we're going to pay them a visit at their hotel. Nothing threatening, just a friendly chat to let them know we're watching." Rico looked concerned. "Boss, maybe we should think this through a little more. If they spotted our surveillance that easily, they might be expecting us to escalate." But Jake's pride was wounded, and his judgment was clouded by frustration. He was tired of being made to look foolish by a bunch of people in suits. It was time to remind them who they were dealing with. That evening, Jake's team assembled in the parking lot of the Millbrook Inn, the only decent hotel in town. They weren't armed. This was meant to be a psychological operation, not a confrontation. The plan was to accidentally run into Price's team and have a casual conversation that would make it clear they were being watched, that Jake had chosen the timing carefully. Most hotel guests would be having dinner or relaxing in their rooms. The parking lot would be quiet, giving them the perfect opportunity for an unexpected encounter. They parked their truck at the far end of the lot and walked casually toward the hotel entrance. Jake felt confident that this time they would be the ones in control of the situation. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by flashing red and blue lights before they had taken 10 steps. "Gentlemen, please place your hands where I can see them," came the voice of Sheriff Patterson over a patrol car loudspeaker. Jake's mind reeled as 3 police cruisers blocked their path. Patterson stepped out of his vehicle, looking more serious than Jake had ever seen him. "Sheriff, what's going on?" Jake asked, genuinely confused. "We're just here to talk to some people." Patterson walked over to Jake, his expression grim. "Jake, I need you and your team to come with me for questioning. We received reports of suspicious individuals conducting surveillance activities around town." As they were escorted to the patrol cars, Jake caught a glimpse of Price standing in the hotel lobby, watching through the glass doors. The man wasn't smiling this time, but there was something in his expression that was even worse: professional satisfaction. At the police station, Jake learned the full extent of how badly his operation had failed. Not only had Price's team detected their surveillance from the very beginning, but they had documented everything. Photos of Jake's team in their observation positions, recordings of their radio communications, even copies of their vehicle license plates. Patterson spread the evidence out on the interrogation room table. "Jake, these people have been recording your activities since this morning. They've got enough documentation to support harassment charges if they want to file them. How is that possible?" Jake asked, staring at clear photographs of himself, using binoculars from what he thought was a concealed position. I don't know, Patterson replied. But these folks came in here 3 hours ago with a complete file on your team's movements. They knew exactly where you were and what you were doing at all times. The worst part came when Patterson handed Jake a thick folder. They also provided this, Patterson said quietly. Information about some of the equipment you've been using for your security business. Apparently, some of it requires federal licenses that you might not have. Jake opened the folder and felt his world start to crumble. Inside were detailed records of every piece of military surplus equipment his team had purchased over the past 2 years. Equipment that he thought was perfectly legal to own, but apparently required special permits for commercial use. Jake, Patterson continued, I've known you since you were a kid, and I respect what you and your team did overseas. But these people are playing a completely different game than anything you've seen before. As Jake sat in that interrogation room, looking at evidence that could destroy his business and possibly land him in serious legal trouble, he finally understood what Price had meant about reconsidering their approach. They weren't fighting the war they thought they were fighting, and they were losing badly. Jake barely slept for the next 3 days. Every time his phone rang, he expected bad news. The police had released him and his team with warnings, but the damage was already spreading like wildfire through his life. What started as a simple confrontation with some corporate security guys had turned into a nightmare that seemed to get worse by the hour. The first blow came Monday morning when Jake received a call from the county sheriff's department. They were canceling their upcoming tactical training contract, effective immediately. The voice on the other end was polite but firm. We've received some concerning reports about your methods. Jake, the department has decided to go with a different training provider. Jake tried to argue, but the decision was final. That contract was worth $15,000 and had been scheduled for the next month. Worse yet, it was supposed to lead to similar contracts with 3 other departments in the region. Tuesday brought more bad news. A security contract for the county fair, their biggest job of the summer, was suddenly terminated. The fair board president called personally to deliver the news. Jake, we've always appreciated your service, but we can't take any risks with public safety. Some concerns have been raised about your company's recent activities. By Wednesday, Jake's phone was ringing constantly, but not with new business. Instead, it was existing clients calling to cancel or postpone their contracts. The excuses were always different, but Jake could read between the lines. Someone was systematically destroying his reputation in the security industry. Rico was the first to figure out how it was happening. He called Jake in a panic Wednesday afternoon. Boss, you need to see something. Check your email right now. Jake opened his laptop and found a new message in his inbox. The sender was listed as anonymous, but the content made his blood run cold. It was a detailed report about Morrison Security Solutions, complete with photos of their training facility, copies of their business licenses, and most disturbing of all, a professional analysis of their aggressive tactical methods and concerning escalation patterns. The report made Jake's team sound like dangerous vigilantes who were one step away from starting their own private war. It highlighted every piece of military equipment they owned, questioned their training methods, and painted their recent surveillance activities as evidence of unstable behavior. How many people do you think received this? Jake asked Rico over the phone, based on the client calls we've been getting. Probably everyone we've ever worked with, plus every potential client in a 50-mile radius. Jake felt sick. Someone had taken the time to research his business, thoroughly document every aspect of their operations, and then craft a report designed to destroy their credibility. This wasn't just corporate competition. This was professional character assassination. The hits kept coming. Thursday morning, Jake received a certified letter from his bank. His business accounts were being frozen pending an investigation into suspicious equipment purchases and potential violations of federal regulations. The letter referenced specific transactions from the past 6 months, including the purchase of night vision equipment and communications gear. Jake had bought all of that equipment legally from surplus dealers, but apparently using it for commercial Security work required additional permits and licenses that he didn't have. Someone had done their homework and found every legal vulnerability in his business operations. Friday brought the most personal attack yet. Chun called Jake in tears. They got to my ex-husband, she said. Federal agents showed up at his house in Denver asking questions about me. They wanted to know about my behavior, my mental state, whether I'd been acting strangely since coming back from deployment. Jake's stomach dropped. What kind of questions? PTSD symptoms, anger issues, whether I'd been stockpiling weapons, or talking about taking action against perceived enemies. David is freaking out. He's threatening to use this in our custody case. Tommy got hit the same day. His veterans' benefits were suddenly under review. Due to concerning behavior reports filed with the VA, someone had compiled a dossier, claiming that Tommy was showing signs of violent instability and might be a danger to himself or others. Boss, they're not just going after our business, Tommy said when he called Jake. They're going after our personal lives, our families, our benefits, everything. Rico's turn came over the weekend. His concealed carry permit was suspended pending a routine review of his suitability to carry firearms. The review process could take months, and without his permit, Rico couldn't work most security jobs. Jake sat in his office Sunday night, staring at the pile of legal documents, canceled contracts, and threatening letters that had accumulated over the past week. His successful security business was crumbling around him, and he still didn't fully understand how it was happening. The worst part was the precision of the attacks. Whoever was behind this understood exactly how to dismantle their lives piece by piece. They knew which pressure points would cause the most damage, which legal vulnerabilities to exploit, and how to make everything look like legitimate regulatory action rather than targeted harassment. Jake's phone rang, and he almost didn't answer it. He expected another cancellation or legal threat. Instead, it was Sheriff Patterson. Jake, I need you to come down to the station. There's something you need to know. An hour later, Jake sat across from Patterson in the same interrogation room. Where this nightmare had started, Patterson looked tired and troubled. Jake, I've been a cop for 23 years, and I've never seen anything like this, Patterson began. In the past week, I've received more inquiries about you and your team than I got about the Mason drug bust last year. What kind of inquiries? Federal agencies I've never heard of, insurance investigators, regulatory compliance officers, people asking about your business practices, your mental health, your equipment purchases, your training methods. It's like someone activated every possible angle of investigation at the same time. Patterson leaned forward, his expression serious. Jake, I've tried to support you and your team because I know you're good people, but the pressure I'm getting from above is intense. There are people making phone calls and filing reports who have connections I can't fight. What are you saying? I'm saying that whoever you've gotten sideways with has resources and influence that go way beyond anything I've ever dealt with. They're not just trying to win some local business dispute. They're trying to completely destroy your ability to operate in this field. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Sheriff, all we did was provide security for a town meeting and try to keep an eye on some corporate security guys. How did that turn into this? Patterson shook his head. I don't know, but I can tell you this. The people you're dealing with aren't regular corporate security. The documentation they provided about your surveillance operation was professional grade. The legal research they did on your business licenses was better than what most lawyers could produce. And the speed with which they've been able to coordinate all these different investigations tells me they have serious connections. As Jake drove home from the police station, he tried to process what Patterson had told him. His team had treated this like a simple confrontation between local veterans and outside corporate interests. Instead, they had somehow stumbled into a conflict with people who operated on a completely different level. These weren't just security guards with fancy suits. They were professionals who understood how to use legal systems, regulatory agencies, and information networks as weapons. While Jake's team had been thinking about surveillance and intimidation tactics, their opponents had been systematically dismantling their entire lives. Jake pulled into his driveway and sat in his truck for a long time, staring at his house. Inside, his wife was probably wondering why he'd been so stressed and secretive lately. His kids were asking why Daddy seemed angry all the time. His whole family was being affected by a war they didn't even know was happening, for the first time. Since returning from overseas, Jake Morrison felt completely outmatched and helpless. He had thought his military experience prepared him for any conflict, but this enemy was fighting battles he didn't even know how to recognize, let alone win. Tomorrow, he would have to figure out how to surrender to an opponent he still didn't fully understand. Jake stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror Monday morning, barely recognizing the man looking back at him. Dark circles under his eyes, stubble from not shaving, and a look of defeat that he hadn't seen since his worst days overseas. His wife had been asking questions he couldn't answer, and his kids kept asking why Daddy seemed so sad all the time. The phone call came at exactly 9 o'clock. Sheriff Patterson's voice was quiet and careful. "Jake, David Price wants to meet. With you, just you, no lawyers, no other team members. He says he has something important to discuss about resolving this situation." Jake's first instinct was to refuse. Every interaction with Price had ended badly for him and his team. But as he looked around his house at the bills piling up, the legal documents scattered across his kitchen table, and the stress that was destroying his family, Jake realized he didn't have many options left. Where does he want to meet? Murphy's Diner, 11 o'clock. He specifically requested a public place. 2 hours later, Jake walked into the small-town diner that had been serving the same coffee and pie for 30 years. Price was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a clear view of the entire restaurant. He was alone, wearing jeans and a simple button-down shirt instead of his usual business suit. Jake slid into the booth across from him, feeling like he was walking into a trap but having no choice but to spring it. "Mr. Morrison," Price said, extending his hand for a handshake. "Thank you for coming." Jake shook the offered hand reluctantly. "Let's just get to the point. What do you want?" Price signaled the waitress for coffee and waited until she was out of earshot before speaking. "I want to end this conflict before it destroys your life completely," Price said simply. "And I think it's time you understood who you've been fighting." Jake felt his anger rising. "I know exactly who I've been fighting. Corporate security trying to steamroll our community." Price reached into his jacket and pulled out a thin folder, placing it on the table between them. "Open it." Jake hesitated, then flipped open the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a military service record. As Jake read it, his face went pale. David Price, United States Marine Corps, Force Reconnaissance. 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan. Bronze Star with V device. Purple Heart, honorable discharge as a gunnery sergeant. Jake looked up at Price, his mind reeling. "You single quotes read ... a Marine, yes?" 12 years active duty, then 15 years in corporate intelligence and security consulting. Price's voice remained calm. But now Jake could hear the authority that came from real command experience. Price gestured to the folder. "Keep reading." Jake turned the page and found service records for Price's entire team. The quiet woman who had been taking pictures around town was a former Army intelligence officer with a degree in international relations. One of the men from the diner was an ex-Navy SEAL who had transitioned into cybersecurity. Another team member was a former CIA case officer who now specialized in corporate risk assessment. "We're not corporate security guards, Jake," Price continued. "We're former military and intelligence professionals who work for companies that need serious protection and risk management. The kind of people who understand that modern warfare isn't always fought with guns and explosives." Jake stared at the documents, trying to process what he was learning. "But why didn't you tell us this from the beginning?" Price leaned back in his seat. "Because you never asked. You took one look at us and decided we were soft corporate types who couldn't handle real conflict. You assumed that because you had combat experience, you automatically had the advantage." The waitress brought coffee, and Price waited until she left before continuing. "Jake, you and your team made a classic mistake. You prepared for the last war instead of the one you were actually fighting. In Afghanistan, the enemy came at you with weapons and explosives. You could see them, identify them, and use your training to neutralize the threat. Price took a sip of his coffee. But this isn't Afghanistan. This is corporate America, where battles are fought with lawyers, accountants, regulatory agencies, and information networks. Your military training actually worked against you because it made you overconfident in a situation that required completely different skills. Jake felt his world shifting underneath him. Everything he had believed about this conflict was wrong. So all that stuff about permits and licenses ... was completely legitimate, Price replied. We didn't manufacture those problems, Jake. We just did our homework and found vulnerabilities that already existed in your business operations. Any competent corporate security team would have done the same basic research. Price pulled out his phone and showed Jake a series of photos. They were pictures of Jake's team conducting their surveillance operation, taken from multiple angles, with professional equipment. You thought you were running a covert operation, but you were actually performing for an audience, Price explained. We spotted your surveillance within the first hour and documented everything you did. Not because we're superhuman, but because we've been trained to identify and counter exactly the kind of tactics you were using. Jake stared at the photos, seeing his own mistakes with painful clarity. His team had used textbook military surveillance, techniques that were designed for foreign combat zones, not for a small American town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The truth is, Jake, your team is good at what you were trained to do. In a firefight or a tactical situation, you'd probably wipe the floor with us. But you tried to fight an information war with infantry tactics. Price leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. Let me explain how this really works. While you were setting up observation posts and planning psychological operations, my team was researching your business licenses, analyzing your client base, reviewing your equipment purchases, and identifying everyone in your network who might be vulnerable to pressure. Jake felt sick as the full scope of his defeat became clear. We knew about Chun's custody issues within 24 hours of arriving in town. We knew about Tommy's financial troubles and Rico's permit status. We knew about your equipment purchases and the legal gray areas in your business operations. All of that information was available through perfectly legal channels if you know where to look. Price pulled out another document. This is what professional intelligence gathering looks like in the corporate world. Financial records, legal documents, background checks, social media analysis, professional network mapping. By the time we had our first face-to-face conversation, we knew more about your team than you probably knew about each other. Jake looked at the comprehensive dossier that Price's team had compiled about Morrison Security Solutions. It was more detailed than anything Jake had ever seen, even in military briefings. The phone calls to your clients weren't threats or lies, Price continued. They were factual reports about regulatory compliance issues and liability concerns. Your business really did have permit problems. Your training methods really were more aggressive than industry standards. We just made sure the right people knew about it. Jake finally understood the scope of his defeat. So while we were playing soldier, you were playing chess. Not playing, Jake, working. This is what we do for a living. Corporate risk assessment, competitive intelligence, crisis management. We identify threats to our clients' interests and neutralize them using legal, financial, and regulatory pressure. Price finished his coffee and looked directly at Jake. You thought combat experience made you warriors, but you never learned that real warfare isn't about who can shoot straighter or move faster. It's about information, resources, and understanding your enemy better than they understand themselves. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Everything he had believed about his own capabilities, his team's advantages, and the nature of conflict had been wrong. So what happens now? Jake asked quietly. Price stood up and left a $10 bill on the table. Now you decide whether you want to keep fighting a war you can't win or whether you want to learn from this experience and move forward. He paused at the edge of the booth. For what it's worth, Jake, I respect what you and your team did overseas. But service in Afghanistan doesn't automatically qualify you for every type of conflict you might face back home. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is recognize when you're outmatched and adapt accordingly. As Price walked away, Jake sat alone in the diner, staring at the files spread across the table. For the first time since returning from deployment, he truly understood that his military experience, while valuable, was just one type of training for one type of war. The hardest lesson of his life was realizing that real strength sometimes meant knowing when you were beaten and learning from the people who had outsmarted you.